Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to our conference on dual labor markets, minimum wages, and inequality. I'd like to invite all the presenters from the first session here to the speakers table, so we don't waste time for walking, running, and things like that during the first session. Yes, I mean it's those of you who attend more conferences are not. We are still missing Joanna Terowicz here, but we are not really that surprised. We know that she likes to have a big entrance to the conference, and she will join us in a few minutes. That's as usual. I will just give a very short. Let me introduce the speakers for the first session. We have Pietro Garibaldi from University of Torino, Collegio Carlo Alberto, who will give a first speech, a keynote speech in the first session. We have Jörg Perschner from European Commission, who will give a presentation more focused on Poland and also some comparative statistics on temporary employment incidents and the risk of duality. Then we will have Joanna giving presentation on Poland, and then Clemente Pignatti from the ILO will give comments to the session, and then we'll open the floor for the discussion. So let me just give you a brief introduction to the whole conference. The conference lasts 2 days. The first day will be devoted to the issues related to the spread of temporary employment, to the non-regular employment forms, which are, let's say, proliferated across developing countries, Europe in particular in Poland. The second day will be devoted to a little bit different but connected issues, to minimum wages and to broadly understood inequalities on the labor market. So, first of all, I'll give you just 4 slides to introduce these topics. On this slide, which I have stolen, let's say, from the recent OECD Employment Outlook, you can see that the incidence of fixed-term contracts, of temporary jobs, has increased during the crisis or over the crisis in most of the developed countries. On this slide, I want to focus only on fixed-term contracts share among new hires, which in general is something that we can understand, that we can accept, let's say, that temporary jobs are supposed to serve as a way for people to enter employment overall or enter employment in a particular company. You can see at the same time that there is a huge difference in the scope, how often the temporary contracts, the fixed-term contracts, are being used to set up the relationship between the company and the worker. And so this is the one, let's say, margin of the phenomenon that we would like to focus. But the problem in most of the cases, how we understood the challenges related to temporary employment, the problem in most of the cases is related to the fact that sometimes temporary jobs turn out quite permanent, and they become a stable feature of the labor market, not only from the macro perspective, when we have a fair share of workers working on temporary jobs in countries like Poland, Spain, or others, but also they become kind of stable feature of the labor market for individuals. And this is what creates problems. And this is what is labeled as labor market duality. In most of the cases today, we would like to focus not really on the incidence of the temporary jobs, of fixed-term contracts, or all the other forms themselves, but rather on the fact that some of the people are trapped for a while. On this slide, it's also a little bit manipulation on the OECD Employment Outlook chapter on the non-regular jobs, which has been released a few weeks ago. You can see that Poland stands out with the highest share of workers working on temporary contracts. At the same time, it is characterized by the transitions into permanent jobs which are close to the OECD average. And as a result, that means that Poland experienced the second highest after Spain share of workers who spent time in temporary jobs for over 3 years. You can see that Spain stands out as a country where these outflows to permanent jobs are relatively low, and the share of people who are working over 3 years in temporary jobs is relatively high. But if you look at even if you look at Poland, you can see that in Poland the share of workers who are temporarily employed for over 3 years, it's 17.4, and it's actually higher than the total temporary employment in 16 of 21 countries here on this slide. And so actually we would like to focus most on these people who are on this red part of the graph here. Tomorrow we will focus on minimum wages, which are becoming a very often discussed topic. Again, Germany is introducing a national minimum wage from the next year. In Poland, we have seen several increases over the last few years. China is debating introduction of the minimum wage across the entire economy. Switzerland has just had a referendum on increasing the minimum wages to extremely high levels on European standard. I guess that's also because the minimum wage is very simple policy to implement. It's much simpler than most of the tax policies, and definitely much simpler than, let's say, active labor market policies. But we would like, we also have we always have to face the question how high the minimum wage should be, and does it help? Does it help workers, or does it hinder their position on the labor market? And on this slide, you can see that. I didn't really wanted to show the comparison of minimum wages across Europe in euros, so I chose to present some specific way of purchasing power parity. That means how many beers you can buy for a minimum wage in particular countries. And on this slide, you can see that Germany is actually shooting quite high with the minimum wage to be implemented from next year. It's going to be actually lower only than in Netherlands and in Germany. Yes, of course, that also results from the differences in prices. You can see that Czech Republic and Slovakia have higher minimum wage in beer terms than Poland, which obviously results from differences in prices. But I would rather refrain from discussing what are the social preferences. You can argue that for France it should be rather wine than beer or whatever. The thing is that the point I would like to make is that the minimum wages are becoming politically and research-wise a very hot topic again, and we would like to initiate this discussion with you, also with relation to the other policies, because in my opinion, too often it happens, especially in Poland, that we discuss particular policies forgetting about the fact that they interact with other policies. And finally, the last slide is just for Poland. The last session tomorrow will be on labor market and inequalities and poverties in a broad sense. And on this slide, I would like to show you what's the overlap for Poland of people who are poor and of workers who are poor and workers who are low-paid people. And you can see that actually it's less than 50% of low-paid people, of low-wage earners in Poland who are poor at the same time. And you can see that majority of people on low-wage jobs are not poor. Why is that? That's because the distribution of jobs and distribution of incomes across households matter, let's say, to the same extent. And sometimes it happens that we focus to higher extent on just distribution of income between workers, and we don't focus enough on distribution of workers among households, which overall determine what's the income inequality and what are the poverty risk. And this will be a topic of the final tomorrow session. Thank you very much for joining us, and now I will give the floor to Pietro Garibaldi for the first presentation.